Hello everyone, and welcome to The Painting Paladin. My name is Justin, and this is the fourth part in our 7-part mini-series. Now today, we are going to be covering the magic items that are in the Smurf army. Now some people only mark magic items down in their army roster lists, others use tokens or cards to represent them, and some people use miniatures. I am one of the people who like to use miniatures, otherwise I tend to forget about the magic items. Now my Smurf army has 3 magic items in it. The first is the Shroud of the Saint, and that's held by Papa Smurf, so that will be in a separate video. The second is the Pipes of Terror, and the last one is a special magic item that's not found in the rulebook since this is an Adepticon Clash of Kings exclusive, Ronnie the Bard. So with that being said, let's head to our work desk and get started, shall we? Alright, now before we begin, I undercoated this model with Glaze spray. Now the first color that we're going to be using is Bagpipes Blue, and that's for all the exposed skin areas. Once that's dry, we can move on to the next color, and that's going to be Gollum Blue Glaze, and that's just going to be applied right over the Bagpipes Blue, similar to that of a wash. So just take your time when applying it and watch for pooling, but if you do get any pools, use the tip of your brush to soak them up. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Kaldor Sky. Now we're going to be using this to paint his kilt. Now when applying this, don't forget to paint the part of the kilt that goes across his shoulder there. Also, while painting your kilt, don't forget to paint that small puff that's on his hat. Alright, once that's dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Mccrae Blue, and we're going to be using this to paint the tartan pattern on the kilt. Now for this, I'm painting it into large checker pattern across the whole thing. Now that we have the checker pattern applied, the next color that I'm going to be using is Cabalite Green, and I'm going to be putting this on the left and right of the squares there for that checker pattern. Okay, to finish off our tartan pattern, the next color that we're going to be using is Pallid Witch Flesh. Now I did thin vertical lines in the middle of the blue squares and 2 horizontal lines across the bottom. So just take your time when applying this and make sure your paint is thinned down so it flows smooth. Now that we've finished painting all the tartan on the kilt, the next thing we're going to do is paint that leather strap that goes down in the opposite shoulder, and the color we're going to use for this is Rhinox Hide. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Gorthor Brown, and that's going to be to paint the belt that's around his waist as well as his sporran. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is start painting the bagpipes. Now the first color we're going to use for this is a Batten Black, and that's to paint all the actual pipes there. The next color that we're going to use is Memphiston Red, and that's to paint the bag part of the bagpipes. Moving on, the next thing we're going to paint is his metal shoulder pad, and the color we're going to use for this is Lead Belcher. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is apply a wash to the model. Now the color we're going to be using for this is Nuln Oil, and we're going to be applying it all over the bagpipes, the metal shoulder and its leather strap, the belt, the sporran, and the kilt. So just take your time when applying this and watch for any pooling. Once the wash is dry, we can start moving on to smaller details on the model. So the first thing we're going to do is paint his hair, and the color we're using for this is Troll Slayer Orange. Once that first layer is dry, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be the contrast paint, Gryph-hound Orange. Now we're going to be applying this straight over the Troll Slayer orange, just like a wash. Now that the hair is done, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be Gray Seer. Now we're just going to be applying a layer on the hat, the boots, the rope that's on the top of the bagpipe, and the frills that are on the back of it. Once that's dry, we can move on to the next color, and that's going to be Apothecary White. And it's just going to be applied right on over that Gray Seer. With that last layer applied, this model is finished, and we can move on to the next magic item, Ronnie the Bard. Alright, now just like our Pipes of Terror model, I undercoated this model with Gray Seer spray. So the first color that we're going to be using for this one though is Auric Flesh, and that's going to be applied on the coat as well as that thin band that's on the top of the hat there. Once that first layer is dry, the next color that we're going to be using is a Thonian Camo shade to give the coat a wash. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Genestealer Purple, and we're going to be using that to paint his shoulders, his pants, and his hat. Once that's dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Druchii Violet. We're going to be applying a wash all over those purple areas. Alright, the next color that we're going to be using is Rhinox Hide, and that's to paint his boots and belt. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is paint his skin, and the color we're using for this is the contrast paint, Gollum Flesh. The next thing we're going to do is paint his hair and beard, and the color we're using for this is Gorthor Brown. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is paint the feather on his hat, and the color we're using for this is the contrast paint, Iandin Yellow. The next thing we're going to do is paint the sleeves of his undershirt, and the color we're using for this is Apothecary White. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is paint his lute, and the color we're using for this is Steel Legion Drab. Once that's dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Lead Belcher. Now we're just going to use this to paint that small metal bar that's on the bottom of the lute, as well as the buttons on his coat. Next, we're going to use Abaddon Black, and that's to paint the lute strings, as well as that small hollow hole that's in the center of the lute. And lastly, we're going to use Agrax Earthshade to give a wash to the lute, as well as his belt and boots. With that wash dried, this model is all finished up and both models are ready to be based. Now I'm going to be basing them the same way I did to the Smurf Spearman in our first video. Alright, now that we've finished up these two, they can fulfill their roles and help bring destruction to their enemies. Now, two things to remember when painting these miniatures. The first is when painting a new miniature, it helps to plan your colors out beforehand so you know what you're going to do. And the second is take your time to avoid any mistakes. But if you make any mistakes, you can always go back to your previous colors and correct it. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to stay up to date with future videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks everyone.